Hello and welcome to this super quick review and clarification presentation. I want to take a couple of minutes to address some of the questions that I've received from students over the last couple of weeks with regard to project number 2, because I imagine if one student or two students are asking me questions, then likely other students have similar questions. So first, I want to talk about that analytical section, the pattern-based section of your paper. A couple of students have asked me about anecdotal evidence. That is, can they use anecdotal evidence in the pattern section? I know some folks are writing about discourses with which they're quite familiar, and so they're wondering if they can use themselves as the evidence. And the answer is yes and that is, I do not mind if you're using yourself as evidence if you have the credibility. At the same time, you cannot rely solely on yourself. That is, I still need specific examples from the discourse. So I still need those examples that are coming from the website, from manuals, from YouTube clips, from the discourse itself. So anecdotal support can be used, but it cannot be used alone. Hope that clarifies. Now, a couple of little things with the next section. There have definitely been those folks who have said, you know, Berman, I'm having some trouble here because I think I'm mixing the values and the patterns and the narratives all together. And I get that. However, one of the big parts of this assignment is to get students to distinguish between the patterns that exist and where those patterns come from, why they're even being used. And to address those questions, the where questions and the why questions, we're drawing conclusions about those values and about those narratives that underpin. So you should be able to draw a distinction between those two. And I can give you a couple of examples. One example I have on the document here. I have a student that's writing a paper on cosmetology schools and on the marketing of cosmetology schools. And so in this paper, the student is developing patterns. The schools are always trying to sell prestige, they're trying to sell trendiness and hipness, and they're trying to sell professionalism. And so these are patterns. There's a ton of language about prestige, there's a ton of language and images about trendiness and hipness, and there's a ton of language about being a professional. So these patterns are underpinned by this cultural narrative that everybody has to get more education, that everybody needs to get some sort of education in higher ed. And it's that narrative that allows for these patterns then to work. And so we can distinguish between the patterns that exist and the narrative that underpins those patterns. And so I give that one example as an example of what I'm looking for. There's a relationship here between patterns and the narratives or the values you see, and I want to make sure that I can see how students are drawing conclusions about those values and those narratives. I hope that helps a little bit. Also, when you move into the next section and you start to think about other discourses that are related to the specific discourse that you're addressing, realize that we're thinking about that relationship specifically with regard to these values and these narratives. And so it's possible that you are thinking of other discourses that may not have the same exact patterns, but that do perpetuate certain value systems and certain narratives. So again, once our paper moves to a discussion about values and narratives, then that's where we're starting to build from as we move to the second half of the paper. Finally, let me address some of the formatting and citing questions that I've received. Some folks have asked, okay, so what should this look like in the end? And the answer is, I don't know. Now, what I really mean is that you have choice. Some folks they give me a paper and it looks how a quote-unquote essay would look. And I have no problem with that as long as conceptually you've addressed all of the different moves of the assignment. Other folks are using the hyperlinks and they're embedding images and they want to use headings or subheadings and they're organizing it in a way that doesn't quite seem like a quote-unquote academic essay. Again, as long as you're dealing with all of the components or all of the moves of the project, that's fine. You can organize it that way. And so for me, the idea is that there are certain skills that we're working on. How you ultimately decide to organize the paper is up to you. Now, part of that is also about giving credit to our sources. And so for this assignment, we're thinking with regard to informal citation. And specifically what I mean here is I'm not demanding that people use APA guidelines of documentation or MLA guidelines of documentation. Instead, we're thinking of informal citation. And this means that for each piece of evidence you're bringing in, you are very clear in the writing itself about where that evidence originated. So if you're bringing in a screenshot from a website and you took the screenshot and you've put it in your paper, then in your writing, you're going to clarify that this is a screenshot that you took. If you're bringing in an article, some outside research, you can easily name the article, name the source of the article, even name the author in the article, and then, should you wish, you can hyperlink it, so if need be, I could access it. So an example would be, according to the article Too Much Too Soon in the New York Times, author Sam Shepard explains. And so I'm giving the information, I'm informally citing in the text itself. And so the idea here is that, yes, we need to be fair. We need to attribute. We need to explain where we're getting all of this evidence that we're bringing into the paper. But we do not necessarily need to have a works cited page. We do not necessarily need to have in-text citations with parenthetical statements and all of that. We will do that in the next assignment. But for now, I want to make sure that people are being fair to the evidence that they're bringing in and that they're informally citing their sources. You'll notice that in everyday writing, this is actually what happens far more frequently. Hope that these little points clarify, and I look forward to those final projects. Take care.